Well, welcome to another Risk and Resilience Dialogue session with the University of New South Wales. And before we go on, I'd like to welcome all people and acknowledge the Gadigal and the Ngunnawal people of both Canberra and Sydney. I'm working from Canberra currently with this video. And I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and those who may be listening who will be elders and advisors into the future. And today it's my great pleasure to have on the chat, on the vidcast, Dr. Diaswati Mardiasmo, who is the Chief Economist of PRD in Australia. Welcome, Dr. Mardiasmo.
Hello, Paul. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our chat.
May I call you Asti?
Yes. For those of you who do not know me, my nickname is Asti, and that's why Paul is calling me that.
Well, sometimes I wonder, Asti, whether you actually respond to Diaswati or Asti more predominantly. I suspect Asti is something that your ears are more attuned to.
Yes, definitely. But it's always nice being acknowledged by my first name.
Well, Dr. Mardiasmo, may I lead into our discussion with positioning the conversation. The real estate industry in Australia, across the country, there are many players within the retail market, many individual companies, represented by a peak body looking at the national interests of the real estate industry. But one of the things I'd like to ask your views on is, in recent years with the Rockefeller Foundation and the 100 Resilient Cities program, certainly Melbourne and Sydney have been members of that organisation with individual 100 Resilient Cities offices. The notion of resilience in urban and rural urban settings is a very current issue. Certainly into the future it will be with climate change and weather variability. In terms of your experience of working as the Chief Economist with PRD and within the industry itself, have you noticed any specific enablements within the industry or options or opportunities for the industry to be more active in the notion of resilient cities and resilient urban spaces?
That is a really, really good question, Paul. And the reason why I say that is I think across the whole industry, there is a recognition that we need to be more community minded and we need to be more creating communities that can withstand any kind of shock, whether that's a financial shock, whether that's a bushfire or a flood or any other natural disasters. There is now more awareness in how do we create, whether it is a retail stock, whether it is residential, whether it's master plan communities, whether it's new townhouses or new housing or new block of unit apartments, how do we create a product that can withstand more shocks? Now, these shocks can, like I said, can be economic, it can be disasters, it can be a pandemic like COVID, for example, and creating something that can withstand that. That sort of notion is definitely something that the real estate industry is becoming more aware of. Now, the level in which everyone within the real estate industry is aware of, that's another matter. So obviously you have your peak bodies, you have the Australian federal government, you have the different planning groups within Victoria government planning or the Queensland's government planning, and they're all making changes to building construction models and building construction needs, making sure that, all of the materials that are being used are, reducing risks when it comes to natural disasters. However, that's only one part of the real estate industry. That's the policymakers, that's the government, trying to sort of regulate how do we create products that is resilient, that can withstand shock. This then flows on to the developers themselves, to people who are creating that stock and to actually put all of these recommendations and all of these notions into creating something that is highly resilient. Now, once they've created something and during the process in which they created something, one of the key things that the real estate industry is becoming more and more and more aware of is involving the community itself in the planning and the design process. So what does the community actually want? How do they want it to look? What are the amenities that they need around them so that they can exist almost kind of like in an urban bubble, that if something happens in that particular urban bubble, they can withstand it themselves. So community consultation is forefront in every single developer's mind right now. And so you've got that sort of this level here. You can kind of segment it into almost three categories. You've got the industry peak body and the government who are making the policies. You've got the developers who are creating the stock or creating the product in consultation with community. And then at the very last part, or the third part, which I would say is probably the key stakeholder, are the real estate agents, are the property leasing managers, who are more often than not is your bridge, the first conduit between someone who is thinking about buying a home or renting a home and the people who are selling the home or creating the home. So I say that the real estate agents are your first front people that needs to know about resilience and needs to be educated in it. Because Paul, if you want to buy a home, do you go to your local MP and say, hey, what's in stock? You know, what home should I buy? Do you go to, you know, your federal member of the government? Do you go to any of those people? You don't. The first person that you go to is your local real estate agent, right? And unfortunately, at the moment, you know, there's a lot of information and education in the first part, which is that government and the real estate industry bodies. It is filtered down a little bit to the developers because they have to comply with, you know, new rules, regulations, what have you. But then the concept of resilience, the concept of urban resilience is not transferred through to real estate agents. If you pull up any real estate agent off the street and you start talking to them about urban resilience, they may look at you blankly in terms of, well, what does this mean? What is it? I don't know what you're talking about. And once you break it down to them the way that I have just done, it makes sense to them. But the concepts do not.
Actually, the insurance industry is also obviously, with house insurance, home and contents insurance, a critical player in the mix of how one would purchase a home or purchase investment properties or any real estate decision making. The relationship obviously with this had to link to reinsurers at a more macro level, but certainly a direct link to the insurance industry. Now, Suncorp Queensland, for example, have special deals for people who have special roof mitigation hooks to keep their roofs on in, say, North Queensland with cyclones. If we take a look at what's happening in North America now with the heat effects in terms of the massively high temperatures for long periods of time, and we look at Sydney, for example, the western suburbs of Sydney, or even Brisbane or any of our large cities in summer, there are heat island effects that happen in the urban city space, but there's also longer periods of heat stress.
Yeah.
The relationship between community health and safety with retrofit in building stock and insurability for a whole range of damage issues, the mix of issues seem to be going from a community public health national resilience perspective. And from what you're suggesting, there is a gap in discussions and talk about how the real estate industry and other players at local levels enmeshing, combining a whole range of people working in a system together to mitigate the effects of just one natural hazard being heat. Is that a future issue that needs to be addressed, and is it being addressed?
In terms of whether or not it's being addressed, it's a yes and no question. Or a yes and no answer, sorry. It's a yes answer by certain stakeholders. So for example, you know, the federal government is acknowledging it in the federal budget 2021. They've allocated $10 billion when it comes to the reinsurance pool for 2021. where they are guaranteeing or they are putting into the reinsurance pool for any homes or any properties, whether it is residential or a small business, should there be any issues where they are impacted or they're more prone to hazardous or more prone to natural disaster risk. So the federal government is playing an active role in this, acknowledging that for many properties, a lot of people are hesitant into taking up in buying those properties or investing into those properties because they feel that the insurance premium would be much too high, and they feel that any insurance or any sort of claims will be too complicated, too long, too everything. And so the federal government is very much so active in this space. Now, a lot of developers are active in this space as well, in terms of taking up some of the local grants on ensuring that their buildings are more green or more sustainable. They're introducing all sorts of different initiatives, whether it's at local government or state level, to make sure that a lot of the buildings are more green. And I do know that there's a lot of developers that kind of fight for that, it's 5-star green rating or 6-star green rating, all of those things. And that does incorporate airflow, making sure you've got double glass windows, heat proof, insulation systems, better flooring, smoke alarms, all of those sort of things are incorporated into that. So there are developers that are very active in that space as well. And a lot of developers know that Green Star rating sells because, I'm sure that we can all agree, most of the population is becoming more aware of the impacts of climate change, the impacts of or the preference towards renewable energy, the need to mitigate risk, in terms of hazards and in terms of natural disasters. Most of the general population could agree with this, and they know that it exists. And so there is research that will tell you they are prepared to pay more for buildings or properties that are more green. And so developers have sort of caught on to this. And created stock that speaks to that particular market. Now, the gap that we're talking about here is, to be honest with you, is still that gap between the policymakers that sort of like sit here and the real estate agents, which is what PRD sort of stands for, because we are really a real estate agent company. We do the property management across Australia. We have offices across Australia. It's more that conversation between what are the education points for real estate agents in this space that they need to know to communicate to their buyers, to their clients, to anyone in their database. So that's where the gap is at the moment, Paul.
Also, I see there's been a lot of recognition within the finance industry and the impact investment industry writ large with respect to sustainable development goals. And I'll note APRA's recent reports about the bottom line, the green bottom line, exposure of your spreadsheet, so to speak, to natural hazards vulnerabilities. But in recent times, there's also been the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative that looking specifically at implementing UN goals in terms of the UN Finance Initiative that's been around for many years, looking at responsible investment. So you've mentioned property developers are becoming very, very aware of building sustainability and vulnerability reduction into the way in which they do their thinking, planning and their business. Have you seen any issues of sea change within the real estate industry? Now you've mentioned the three segments of our discussion so far. Are there any sea change movements that you would like to either, I won't say predict changes that will come, but certainly anticipate certain things as the chief economist of PRD? What changes might we be seeing in the real estate industry? Changes that you think will happen, and possibly at the other side of that question, changes you would like to see?
Well, changes that I would like to see. Oh my goodness, my list is a little bit long.
Start with the top three.
As it normally is. But if I was to say the top three, and in terms of predictions of what might change, is that we're becoming more of a consumer-driven community consultative industry. Beforehand, it was more of a, based on a cost benefit analysis of, we will build this type of property product because it is the proven formula. It's been like this for the past, 30, 40, 50 years. And this is our standard stock. Whereas the change now, it's becoming more consumer driven. The real estate market is becoming more sort of thinking more about who is our target market and who is it that we want to sell to and what will appeal to them and how do we involve them in consultation so that we create a product for them. And so that's definitely a massive change in the real estate industry. If you think of it from an industry that goes from stock standard to a more customized product, that is a really big change in the way that we do business, in the way that we design product, and also in the way that we market product, and basically in the way that we do a lot of things. So that's one. That's definitely a change that's going to happen. Number two is that the real estate industry is being held more accountable now, in the sense of what is it that we're delivering and how is it creating better service and better stock for the market. People are definitely asking me more about, well, does that product or does that particular master plan community have this? How does it relate when it comes to livability? How does it relate when it comes to affordability? So people are becoming definitely more, dare I say, demanding and holding us more accountable for us to deliver something that is more affordable, something that has a high level of investability, and also something that is highly livable as well. So affordability, investability, and livability are kind of like the three main things that many of, I guess, the general population is holding us accountable for. And those are definitely some buzzwords in the real estate industry. Some of your buzzwords are like resilience and, risk reduction and, things like that. You pose that to real estate agents and also to property managers. And this is my wish list. One of the top two is that education and that sort of like transition and translation between urban resilience and risk reduction to affordability and livability and investability, because those link together. This is the language of resilience, and this is the language of real estate. And we need to somehow merge these two languages together in a way that real estate agents understand that investing in a more resilient product will give you better returns in the future. And therefore, that is what we should be investing in. If they understand that, if they can be educated in that, if that gap is closed, it will be easier for real estate agents to talk to the wider community, the wider client database, the people that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. So, I'm going to move that to my top one, number one, I think, when it comes to the wish list. Because for me, that's where I see the gap is at the moment, Paul. There is a difference in language. And that difference in language is something that we really need to work on so that any real estate agent off the block on the street understands that urban resilience equates to investability in the future.
It's interesting, Asti, that the notion of livability and community that you've alluded to, certainly in the public and community health world, was first mentioned openly 33 years ago, in the Brundtland report. And many of the listeners and viewers who are public health specialists will know that the Brundtland report talked about, initiated the Healthy Cities and Healthy Communities programs that we've seen over the last few years. My last question today, Asti, as the Chief Economist, how has your role evolved through time since you've been with PRD, and where do you think the evolution is going? Because there are chief economists or similar roles in many large real estate groupings in Australia and internationally. But in your experience in the role, and I'm sure you'll have many more years working in the industry and others based on your choice of where you wish to be, how has it evolved since you began working in the space?
Look, Paul, it has evolved a lot. It has changed a lot. I've been with PRD since 2014, and I started off as their national research manager back then in 2014. And my role at the time was more about looking into data trends, looking into property trends, looking into, you know, price growth and rental growth, and where's the best place to invest and what's the market doing, you know, all of that. So that's how I started my role. And, you know, at the time I entered the real estate industry fresh, in the sense that I was transferring from an academic role into an industry role. And so there was that whole understanding just about how the real estate industry actually works. And because PRD is a real estate agency that sells houses and also are property managers, that was the focus. The focus was, what are the housing trends? What are the rental trends? You know, what is the price growth? Which suburb is delivering the most investment returns? That's the focus. And that is still part of the focus right now. But I was appointed as chief economist back in 2019. I was one of the very first chief economists in a residential real estate franchise network. You're right that there are other chief economists, but they're mostly either, you know, bigger data groups, or they are in the commercial space. Whereas in the residential real estate franchise that traditionally sells houses and rents houses, I'm the first chief economist. And the role has really evolved from monitoring the housing market and what's been happening, where it's going, to why, to what is impacting the real estate industry, what is impacting the property market, how has government policy, from whether it's federal, state or local, how has any building industry, construction industry initiatives, how has the community looked at the real estate industry, what are their wants, the international markets, all of the trade agreements that we might have. I'm sure you know that there's a massive shortage in the construction industry at the moment. It's taking everybody so long to be able to get all of the materials that they need to build. And part of that has to do with the trade agreements that we have with some of the other countries. And so, you know, the role has really evolved into, if I can just say it in this way, I feel like the role was about housing, which is like this big. And then now it's gone to this big, about everything else that might impact the property market. And so, you know, I'm very blessed to be able to access a lot of different data points. I'm very blessed to have been chosen to be part of the Property Council of Australia as their residential committee. I'm also the liaison for the Reserve Bank of Australia. So we talk about cash rate, we talk about how money matters and the finances and things like that. And I sit on other boards as well that talks about planning and policy. And recently I was appointed by the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales to deliver some research education to real estate agents across New South Wales. So the role has definitely evolved from simply looking at property trends and, you know, house prices and things like that, to sitting on councils and looking at policy and educating real estate agents. So it's definitely evolved a lot.
Ashley, I think that just from my perspective, the sorts of issues you've mentioned, I don't think they're going to stop. I think the engagement of the real estate industry as a significant part of local economies and city economies and city design and city futures thinking is going to be even more prominent into the future than it has evolved over recent times. We run out of time, Dr. Mardiasmo, but may I invite you back to have part 2 of the discussion, because I'm sure there are issues that we haven't touched on that we could quite viably talk about. So would you be happy to come back and have a part 2 of resilience, risk and resilience dialogues?
Of course, definitely more happy to. Like you said, Paul, this is not something that can be solved immediately. It's not something that can be, finished or looked at in a very short space of time. It will take time for those in the real estate industry, particularly for real estate agent, to fully understand what it is that we are talking about when it comes to risk and resilience, and fully embrace the notion of it, because the culture in the real estate agent space is such that introducing something new requires a lot of massaging, requires a lot of marrying and bridging and education. So it is definitely a space that will just keep on growing, evolving, and I am happy for part 2, part 3, part 4, however many parts that you would like, for us to keep this momentum going and to keep the education going.
Dr. Diaswati Mardiasmo, Chief Economist of PRD, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.